So, to get us started on climate change and give us a context of why cities matter and why we're important to this debate, please join me in giving a warm MAS Summit welcome to Cynthia Rosenzweig, who comes to us from the NASA Institute for Space Studies and the Earth Center at Columbia. We're very happy. Cynthia travels the world talking about this and why cities are important to this discussion, and we're very lucky to have her this morning. Would you welcome, please, Cynthia Rosenzweig.
Good morning, and thank you to the Municipal Arts Society for inviting me to come and share our work and the work of many, many researchers, scientists, experts on climate change in cities. And congratulations also to the summit for New York City, and really including seriously a discussion that needs to happen on how cities respond to climate change. This is the most significant environmental planetary issue of our time and the times to come. So it's really great that this is being considered here, and the discussions such as the question that Mary put up are important questions that we need all to address, not just here in New York City, but in cities around the world. So it turns out that cities are emerging as the first responders to climate change. There was a lot of work done originally on ecosystems, on food supply, and I've also done a lot of that work, and my colleagues have done a lot of that work. But about just really even quite recently, five or so years ago, people realized, where is climate change going to affect people? It's going to affect people where they live. And now that over 50% of the global population lives in cities, cities are becoming a very key actor in responding to climate change. Now, cities are important in climate change for two reasons. First is they're on the front lines, both because they contribute to the causes of climate change in their emissions of greenhouse gases, and also the effects of climate change in terms of the impacts of the changes in climate extremes. Cities are responsible for up to 70% of greenhouse gases. It depends some how you count, like the stuff that we buy, even though it's not made here, relates to the greenhouse gas emissions from cities, even though they occupy only about 2% of the global landmass. And we know it's 50% and growing in terms of the population that are now living in cities. So every year is seeing an addition of almost 70 million new urban dwellers. And most of these are being added to cities in developing countries. So that's why this setting the frame talk is not just focused on New York City, but it's focused on cities around the world as well. What the graph shows is per capita electricity consumption in a range of cities around the world. So on the right, you have Toronto and Denver, right? Those are very highly developed, cold cities, right? Using a lot of electricity. More to the left are some cities that are in developing countries that haven't developed their whole energy and electricity use, for example, air conditioning through dissemination adoption throughout their city, and also in warmer climates. So you see there's a big range, but you also see that cities are big users of electricity, which is one of the burning of fossil fuels for electricity is one of the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions. But it's not only on the cause side that cities are important, but also the effect side, or what we call impacts. So cities and the people who live in them are highly vulnerable to the climate extremes, which are increasing due to climate change and are projected to increase even more. What are these actual climate extremes that cities are facing? More frequent, longer, and more intense heat waves, exacerbated inland flooding from heavy downpours, and the one that all coastal cities are very concerned about is extended coastal flooding due to sea level rise. Now, another reason why cities are so important in climate change, we spoke about the people living there. And we know that there are many citizens in cities around the world who are very vulnerable to climate change. And these are some of the reasons why. The people who lack material resources, who lack lifelines like cars and telephones, lack access to information when we have an evacuation order, for example. There are differences in race and ethnicity in terms of responses and programs to be resilient. And everywhere in the city, there's also impervious environment. So that's why the parks that we're hearing so much about, and I know will be on the agenda today, are so important. That impervious environment increases the risk of flooding tremendously in cities. Vulnerability also is related to age. In particular, elderly people physiologically can't throw off heat as well as regular middle-aged people can, young and middle-aged people can. And also the very young also are vulnerable. So we see in cities vulnerable groups that need to be taken care of and planned for in terms of resilience. Another very important fact that has been emerging is that city leaders are at the right level of governance to take action about climate change. They have more direct contact with their constituents. They're involved in day-to-day management. They're more practical. And they've demonstrated that they've been able to form coordination networks with cities all around the world. So these are some of the major reasons why the role of cities is increasing in the solutions to climate change. However, there are still many challenges. Multiple jurisdictions, cities are embedded in the city, the state, the nation, and the international framework, the new framework that's going to be passed in Paris at the end of the year. Financing mitigation and adaptation measures definitely costs money, often beyond what one city each city can afford. So there are very real financing challenges. There's also uptake, even within a city, that's different understanding and understanding of the importance of the issue, and then across cities. Some cities like New York have been working on climate change since the 1990s. Others are just starting now. There's also been a great focus on the major mega cities and the large cities, but what about all the small and medium-sized cities? There needs to be a big focus on helping them developing their resilience and reducing their greenhouse gas emissions as well. And then, of course, in democratic societies, how do we maintain momentum across election cycles as mayors of cities come and go? But they are truly, despite the challenges, cities are truly emerging as first responses. So what this graph is showing is the planned cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, the percent below the baseline year, for cities around the globe. So all those places are the goals, which range from 20% to 100%. The light green flags are Copenhagen and Melbourne, who have both pledged to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions down to zero. And these networks that I mentioned before, such as C40, Large Cities Climate Group, was launched in London in 2005. The World Mayor Council on Climate Change was launched in Mexico City in 2010. And just last year, at the Climate Summit, when we had the People's March here in New York City, the Compact of Mayors brought all of these networks together, 10 city networks representing more than 2,000 cities, and that Compact of Mayors has pledged to reduce 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2020. And those cities represent about 15% of the world's population. So how are they doing it? How do you actually do this? What are those cities doing? And what are we doing here in New York City? So we are those cities, and here in New York City, there is a big push for energy efficiency. There is a big push for increasing the renewable portfolio in our energy mix. There's a big push for transportation, for public transportation, rather than everybody sitting in cars, burning gasoline, and spewing greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. And then, of course, with waste, too. Solid waste management, extremely important because of the methane emissions that come from there. So we in New York City have a very ambitious goal of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. So we have about 60 gigatons. I'm going to give you the numbers, 60 gigatons now, and we need to reduce by up to 12 in 2050. So it's a challenge. Everybody's going to have to be on board to design the city to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, we have to be resilient to the changing climate extremes as well. So what does the city have to be able to be resilient? So these are some of the well-known factors of resiliency: flexibility, redundancy. We have to have some things that we have to have backup systems. Of course, we have to be resourceful, but New Yorkers are, and city people are in general. We have to have safe failure. So if this is what the energy and Con Ed is doing now, so if one grid goes down, there isn't follow-on, knock-on effects of all of the grids going down after. We have to be responsive to change. Climate change is the operative word. It's going to be changing decade by decade by decade. So we have to be, that's where the flexibility and the responsiveness and the learning come in. We also have to make a partnership. It can't only be government. It has to be the government's very important role, a leadership role, but citizens groups, all the infrastructure managers, every single system, and they need to work together, as we're doing in New York City with the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force, so that we get the interdependencies, not just siloing each system on its own. Of course, private sector, absolutely crucial and so important in urban settings as well. And of course, the last one is knowledge providers. That's us, the researchers and the scientists, so that we're continuing to learn about climate change as all of this keeps going. And it's really a new partnership that is being formed. So what are the approaches to resilience action? It's a portfolio approach and people very often get focused on one of these colored circles. They are policy, social action, engineering, and ecosystems based. So there are advocates for each one of these. For example, in the engineering, there are some people, the engineers, very much like the potential for storm surge barriers, tidal barriers, to save New York City. But what we've learned in the New York City panel on climate change and working with cities around the world is that it has to be a portfolio approach. We need the right policies for emergency activation and zoning. That's what the question is related to that Mary posed just before I started speaking. But we need social programs as well, neighborhood watch programs, so people take care of each other. Of course we need engineering, because so much of the city is engineered, but we can't only focus on that. And then there's a wonderful new approach of ecosystem-based adaptation, and again, New York City has been the lead on that with the wonderful MoMA exhibit and the oyster beds, for example. Things like green roofs, bioswales, wetland restoration programs. So these are the portfolio of resilient actions that are needed. Just to conclude, we're going to step one more step from climate change to the whole issue of sustainability. And this is very exciting because just a few weeks ago at the General Assembly, the new Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. And for the first time, there is a standalone goal for urban areas. It's goal number 11. There was a whole campaign of all the urban groups around the world. And New York groups were very strong, provided very strong leadership. And the goal 11 reads, to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. So so that larger framing of sustainable development is very important. As we now go to the next event of the year, of COP21. COP stands for Conference of the Parties. It's when the nations of the world will come together to really, at long last, make an agreement about greenhouse gas reductions. What is happening in a very exciting way is that cities will are playing an integral role in shaping global climate change policy for the future. So we, on the research side, look forward to working with all of you to really fulfill the role of cities in climate change. Thank you very much.